I used to think loyalty was the most important virtue a person could have, especially when it came to family, but sitting here in my empty apartment surrounded by cardboard boxes containing 15 years of my professional life, I'm starting to realize that blind loyalty might actually be the most dangerous trait you can possess. My name is Elise Morgan, and until 3 weeks ago, I was the operations manager, chief financial officer, head of procurement, and unofficial crisis management specialist for Morgan Construction Supply, the family business my father built from absolutely nothing in our small Midwestern town of Cedar Falls. Today, I'm unemployed, effectively disowned, and discovering that the family I spent my entire adult life protecting never actually saw me as anything more than free labor with a convenient last name. The story really begins when I was 16 years old, standing in the dusty warehouse of our family business on a sweltering July afternoon, manually counting inventory while my younger brother Ryan lounged in the air-conditioned office playing games on the computer that was supposed to be used for invoicing customers. Even then, I should have recognized the pattern that would define the next 15 years of my life, me doing the actual work while Ryan got the credit, the praise, and most importantly, the assumption that he would eventually inherit everything our father had built. Cedar Falls is the kind of town where everyone knows everyone else's business, where the local high school football team's performance determines the mood of the entire community for weeks at a time, and where family businesses are passed down through generations like sacred heirlooms that must be preserved at all costs. Morgan Construction Supply started in 1987 when my father, David Morgan, used his last unemployment check and a loan from my maternal grandfather to rent a small warehouse space and begin selling building materials to local contractors who were tired of driving 2 hours to the nearest city for decent supplies. By the time I graduated high school with a 4.2 GPA and scholarship offers from 3 different universities, Morgan Construction Supply had grown into the primary supplier for construction projects within a 50-mile radius, employing 12 full-time workers and generating enough revenue to provide our family with a comfortable middle-class lifestyle in a community where comfortable middle-class lifestyles were becoming increasingly rare. My father had built something substantial and lasting, something that mattered to our community, and I was genuinely proud to be part of a family that had created jobs and contributed to the local economy in such a meaningful way. The full scholarship to study business administration at the state university should have been my ticket to independence, my opportunity to build my own career and create my own identity separate from the family business that had dominated every dinner conversation throughout my childhood. Instead, when my father had what the doctors called a minor cardiac episode during my sophomore year, I found myself driving home every weekend to help manage the books, handle customer complaints, and ensure that orders were processed correctly while he recovered and Ryan finished his senior year of high school with grades that barely qualified him for community college admission. What started as temporary weekend assistance gradually morphed into a permanent arrangement when my father made it clear that the family needed me more than I needed a college degree, especially since Ryan would eventually be taking over the business anyway and could use my help learning the operational side of things. The logic seemed sound at the time. I could always finish my degree later. The business was growing and needed reliable management, and helping my family during a difficult period was simply the right thing to do for someone who had been raised with strong values about duty and loyalty. My mother, Patricia Morgan, had always been the type of woman who deferred to her husband's judgment on major decisions, nodding along with his pronouncements about our futures while quietly maintaining the household and ensuring that everyone's emotional needs were met as efficiently as possible. When I announced that I was leaving school to work full-time at Morgan Construction Supply, she expressed what seemed like genuine concern about my long-term prospects, but ultimately supported the decision because my father had convinced her that this arrangement would benefit everyone involved, especially Ryan, who would need experienced guidance when he eventually assumed control of the company. Ryan, who was 3 years younger than me but had always possessed the kind of effortless charm and confidence that made adults assume he was destined for great things, seemed perfectly comfortable with the arrangement that positioned me as his unofficial mentor and eventual second-in-command. He would joke about how lucky he was to have such a dedicated older sister willing to handle all the boring business stuff, while he focused on the big-picture strategic thinking that would supposedly transform our small family business into a regional powerhouse that could compete with the major national suppliers. The next 5 years passed in a blur of 14-hour workdays, crisis management situations that required immediate solutions, and gradual expansion of my responsibilities as I proved myself capable of handling increasingly complex aspects of the business operations. I learned to negotiate with suppliers who tried to inflate prices, developed relationships with contractors who appreciated working with someone who understood their timelines and budget constraints, and created systems for inventory management that reduced waste and improved our profit margins by nearly 20% over 3 years. Meanwhile, Ryan completed his associate degree in business, spent a summer working at the warehouse to learn the business from the ground up, and then announced that he wanted to pursue opportunities in the technology sector because he believed traditional construction supply businesses were becoming obsolete and needed to embrace digital transformation in order to survive in an increasingly competitive marketplace. My father, who had always been skeptical of anything involving computers or the internet, was initially resistant to Ryan's plans but eventually agreed to support his pursuit of a bachelor's degree in computer science, with the understanding that he would return to Cedar Falls with innovative ideas that could modernize Morgan Construction Supply. During Ryan's 4-year absence at the state university, I effectively ran the entire business while my father focused on maintaining relationships with our biggest customers and exploring opportunities for expansion into neighboring communities. The responsibility was overwhelming at times, but I genuinely loved the challenge of solving complex logistical problems, the satisfaction of completing projects on time and under budget, and the respect I had earned from our employees and customers who recognized my competence and dedication to maintaining the high standards that had built our reputation in the community. My personal life during this period was virtually non-existent, consisting mainly of occasional dinners with high school friends who had moved away for college and returned with stories about internships in major cities, study abroad programs, and career opportunities that seemed to exist in a completely different universe from the one I inhabited in Cedar Falls. The few romantic relationships I attempted were inevitably complicated by the demands of my work schedule and the fact that most men my age in our community either worked for companies that did business with us or were planning to leave town as soon as possible for better opportunities elsewhere. When Ryan graduated with his computer science degree and announced that he had been offered a position at a technology startup in Seattle, my father's reaction was a mixture of pride in his son's achievements and disappointment that the family business would have to wait even longer for the leadership transition he had been planning since Ryan was in elementary school. I privately felt a combination of relief that I could continue managing things without interference and resentment that Ryan's career development was being treated as a priority while my own professional growth was considered secondary to the family's needs. The startup opportunity was supposed to last 2 years at most, just long enough for Ryan to gain valuable experience in technology and business development that he could eventually bring back to modernize Morgan Construction Supply. Instead, those 2 years stretched into 5 as Ryan moved from company to company, chasing increasingly ambitious projects and larger salary offers while maintaining minimal contact with the family beyond holiday phone calls and occasional social media updates about his exciting life in the Pacific Northwest. During Ryan's extended absence, I continued to expand my role and responsibilities, taking on everything from human resources management to strategic planning for major equipment purchases that would position us for future growth. I developed expertise in areas that my father had never fully understood, including digital marketing strategies that increased our customer base by 40%, computerized inventory management systems that improved our efficiency dramatically, and financial planning processes that helped us weather the economic uncertainty that affected many small businesses during this period. My father's health began to decline gradually when I turned 28. Starting with minor issues like high blood pressure and chronic fatigue that he attributed to the normal stress of running a successful business. His doctor recommended reducing his workload and delegating more responsibilities to trusted employees, advice that resulted in my promotion to an official management position with a salary increase that finally reflected the value of my contributions to the company's success over the previous decade. The stroke happened on a Tuesday morning in March, just as I was reviewing quarterly financial reports and preparing for a meeting with our accountant about tax planning strategies. My mother called from the hospital emergency room, her voice shaking as she explained that my father had collapsed in the warehouse while discussing a large order with one of our biggest contractors, and that the paramedics were running tests to determine the extent of the damage to his brain and motor functions. The next 6 months were a nightmare of medical appointments, insurance paperwork, rehabilitation sessions, and desperate attempts to maintain business operations while my father struggled to regain his speech and mobility. Ryan flew home for a weekend to visit the hospital and attend a family meeting with the doctors, but returned to Seattle after 3 days with promises to check in regularly and help however he could from a distance, which turned out to mean occasional phone calls asking about our father's progress and offering unsolicited advice about business decisions he didn't fully understand. During this crisis period, I essentially became the sole decision-maker for Morgan Construction Supply, working 18-hour days to ensure that customer orders were fulfilled on time, employee paychecks were processed correctly, and vendor relationships were maintained despite the uncertainty surrounding my father's recovery and the company's long-term leadership structure. Our employees, contractors, and suppliers responded with remarkable loyalty and support, recognizing that I had been the driving force behind the company's success for years and trusting my ability to navigate this difficult transition period. When my father finally returned to work on a limited basis 8 months after his stroke, his speech was slightly slurred but his mind was sharp, and he expressed genuine gratitude for my efforts to keep the business running smoothly during his absence. For the first time in my adult life, I felt like he truly saw me as an essential partner in the company rather than just a temporary placeholder until Ryan could assume his rightful position as heir to the family empire. That period of mutual respect and collaboration lasted exactly 14 months, ending abruptly when Ryan called to announce that his latest startup had failed spectacularly, leaving him unemployed and interested in returning to Cedar Falls to finally step up and take responsibility for the family legacy that he had been avoiding for nearly 6 years. The warning signs were obvious in retrospect, starting with Ryan's assumption that he could simply walk back into a leadership role without understanding how dramatically the business had evolved during his absence, continuing with his dismissive attitude toward the systems and relationships I had developed, and culminating in private conversations with my parents about strategic restructuring that apparently didn't require my input despite my intimate knowledge of every aspect of our operations. Ryan's first week back was a masterclass in entitlement and ignorance, as he questioned decisions I had made successfully for years, suggested changes that would have damaged important customer relationships, and generally behaved as though my management of the company during his absence had been an extended babysitting arrangement rather than the professional leadership that had kept Morgan Construction Supply profitable and growing throughout one of the most challenging periods in its history. The confrontation that sealed my fate occurred during what I thought was a routine family meeting to discuss Ryan's integration into the management structure and long-term succession planning for the business. Instead, I found myself facing my parents, Ryan, and a lawyer I had never met before, listening to a carefully prepared speech about how the company needed fresh leadership and new direction that would be best served by a clean transition that removed potential sources of conflict and confusion about the chain of command. In other words, they were firing me from the company I had essentially run for the better part of a decade, the business I had sacrificed my education, my personal relationships, and my own career ambitions to protect and grow, all so that Ryan could return from his failed experiments in the technology sector and claim the inheritance that everyone had always assumed would be his regardless of merit, competence, or actual contribution to the company's success. The severance package was insulting: 6 months of my current salary, continuation of health insurance for 90 days, and a non-compete agreement that would prevent me from working for any construction supply company within a 100-mile radius for 2 full years. The lawyer explained these terms with the kind of professional detachment that suggested this was just another routine business transaction rather than the destruction of a person's entire professional identity and financial security. I didn't even get a handshake, just a lawyer's letter and a lock on my office door. The first month after being exiled from my own life was a masterclass in psychological destruction that I wouldn't wish on my worst enemy, though I'm starting to think my worst enemy might actually be the family I spent 15 years trying to protect and serve with unwavering dedication. I spent most of those initial weeks in my small apartment, which suddenly felt like a prison cell decorated with furniture I had barely noticed during the years when I was working 16-hour days and coming home only to sleep and shower before returning to the office that was no longer mine. The silence was deafening after years of constant phone calls, urgent customer requests, and the familiar sounds of forklifts moving inventory in the warehouse that had become more familiar to me than my own living space. Depression hit me like a freight train carrying a load of concrete blocks, starting with an inability to get out of bed before noon and gradually progressing to entire days spent staring at the ceiling while questioning every decision I had made since leaving college to join the family business that apparently never considered me family enough to deserve basic respect or honest communication about my future role in the organization. My savings account, which had never been substantial because I had always prioritized reinvesting in the business and helping my family during various financial challenges over the years, dwindled rapidly as I struggled to maintain my basic living expenses without the steady paycheck that had defined my adult identity for more than a decade. The severance package that had seemed insultingly small during that devastating meeting with the lawyer now represented the thin line between maintaining my independence and having to move back in with my parents, who had made it clear that my presence in their lives was now optional rather than essential. The isolation was perhaps the most brutal aspect of this period, as I discovered that most of my social connections had been built around work relationships and family obligations rather than genuine friendships that could survive the complete upheaval of my professional and personal circumstances. Former colleagues from Morgan Construction Supply were awkward and distant when I encountered them around town, clearly uncomfortable with acknowledging someone who had been unceremoniously removed from a position of authority and respect within the community's business hierarchy. My parents made perfunctory attempts to maintain some semblance of a normal relationship, inviting me to Sunday dinners where conversation carefully avoided any mention of the business that had consumed my entire adult life. But these gatherings felt like elaborate performances designed to maintain appearances rather than genuine efforts to repair the damage that had been done to our family dynamic by their decision to prioritize Ryan's comfort over my contributions and sacrifices. Ryan himself seemed to genuinely believe that he had rescued me from a situation that was preventing me from pursuing my own independent path in life, offering unsolicited advice about career opportunities in other industries and suggesting that this transition might be exactly what I needed to finally discover my true passions outside the construction supply business that had apparently been holding me back from achieving my full potential. After 6 weeks of wallowing in self-pity and contemplating whether I should use my remaining savings to move to a different city where nobody knew about my professional humiliation, I finally accepted the reality that feeling sorry for myself wasn't going to pay my rent or restore my sense of purpose and self-worth. The job market in Cedar Falls was limited for someone with my specific skill set and experience, particularly given the non-compete agreement that prevented me from working for any of our direct competitors within a 100-mile radius. The position I eventually accepted was at Hartwell Office Solutions, a small company that provided administrative services and office supplies to local businesses, including some of the same contractors who had been loyal customers of Morgan Construction Supply during my tenure there. The job title was Office Manager, which sounded appropriately professional but actually meant I was responsible for everything from answering phones and scheduling appointments to managing inventory for paper clips and printer cartridges, tasks that felt like a cruel parody of the strategic planning and complex problem-solving that had defined my previous role. My new boss, Margaret Hartwell, was a no-nonsense woman in her early 60s who had built her business from nothing over 25 years and had little patience for employees who couldn't adapt quickly to her efficient but demanding management style. She made it clear during my interview that she was aware of my background at Morgan Construction Supply and was interested in my experience with customer relationship management and financial planning, but she also emphasized that this position would require me to start at the bottom and prove myself all over again regardless of my previous accomplishments. The salary was less than half of what I had been earning at Morgan Construction Supply, barely enough to cover my basic living expenses and certainly not sufficient to rebuild the financial security I had lost when my family decided to prioritize Ryan's return over my continued employment. The work itself was mind-numbingly routine compared to the constant challenges and decision-making responsibilities I had handled for years, leaving me with plenty of time to think about how dramatically my circumstances had changed and how uncertain my future prospects had become. However, working at Hartwell Office Solutions did provide me with an unexpected advantage: a front-row seat to observe how Morgan Construction Supply was performing under Ryan's leadership, since several of our mutual customers were happy to share their frustrations and concerns about changes in service quality, pricing policies, and customer communication that had occurred since my departure from the company. The reports I heard were consistently troubling, ranging from delayed deliveries and billing errors to customer service problems that suggested Ryan was struggling to maintain the operational standards that had built our reputation in the community over nearly 30 years. Contractors who had been loyal customers for decades were expressing frustration with new procedures that seemed designed to create efficiency but actually resulted in confusion and delays that affected their project timelines and budgets. Margaret Hartwell, who had been observing my work performance and attitude for several months, eventually began asking pointed questions about my long-term career goals and whether I was genuinely satisfied with filing purchase orders and answering customer service calls when my experience and knowledge could clearly be applied to much more challenging and financially rewarding opportunities. Her advice was characteristically blunt and practical. "Elise, you're wasting your talents in this position, and while I appreciate having someone with your skills handling our day-to-day operations, you're clearly capable of running your own business rather than managing someone else's office supplies. And I think you know that even if you're not ready to admit it to yourself yet." The conversation that followed was the first honest assessment of my situation and potential that I had received since being forced out of Morgan Construction Supply, as Margaret helped me recognize that my knowledge of the construction supply industry, my relationships with contractors and suppliers, and my proven ability to manage complex business operations represented valuable assets that could be leveraged independently rather than just mourned as losses from my previous life. She suggested that I consider offering consulting services to small construction companies that needed help with inventory management, supplier negotiations, or project planning but couldn't afford to hire full-time employees with specialized expertise in these areas. The idea seemed impossible at first, given my non-compete agreement and limited financial resources, but Margaret pointed out that consulting work fell into a different category than direct employment with competitors, and that many of the contractors I had worked with over the years might be interested in paying for advice that could help them improve their operations and profitability. Starting a consulting business while working full-time at Hartwell Office Solutions required careful time management and strategic networking that I approached with the same methodical planning I had used to manage Morgan Construction Supply during various crises over the years. I began by reaching out to contractors who had expressed frustration with changes at my former company, offering to review their supplier relationships and suggest alternative sources for materials that might provide better pricing or service quality. The response was overwhelmingly positive, as several contractors immediately hired me for small projects that allowed me to demonstrate my expertise while building a client base that could eventually support a full-time consulting practice. Word spread quickly through the tight-knit construction community that I was available for independent projects, and within 3 months I was earning almost as much from consulting work as I was receiving from my official job at Hartwell Office Solutions. During this period of slowly rebuilding my professional confidence and financial stability, I made a discovery that would ultimately change everything about my understanding of my legal relationship to Morgan Construction Supply and my family's betrayal of my contributions to the company's success over the previous 15 years. While cleaning out boxes of personal papers that had been sitting untouched in my apartment since my forced departure from the family business, I found a manila folder containing copies of various legal documents related to Morgan Construction Supply that I had maintained from my own records during my years managing the company's administrative functions and financial planning processes. Most of these documents were routine business filings, insurance policies, and equipment purchase agreements that I had kept as backup copies in case the originals were ever damaged or misplaced, but one document immediately caught my attention because I didn't remember seeing it before. A trust agreement dated 10 years earlier that appeared to transfer majority ownership of Morgan Construction Supply to a legal entity called the E.M. Morgan Family Trust. The document was dense with legal terminology that I didn't fully understand, but the basic structure seemed to indicate that my father had established this trust as a way to transfer ownership of the business while maintaining operational control during his lifetime, with specific provisions for how decisions would be made and how ownership would eventually be distributed among family members. What made this document particularly interesting was the revelation that the E.M. in the trust name stood for Elise Marie, indicating that I was apparently the primary beneficiary of this arrangement despite having no memory of being informed about its existence or significance for my future relationship to the company I had been managing without any awareness of my actual legal status as its owner. The implications of this discovery were staggering, suggesting that my family's decision to force me out of Morgan Construction Supply might not have been legally valid if I was actually the majority owner of the company through this trust arrangement that had apparently been established without my knowledge or understanding of its terms and conditions. I spent the next several days researching trust law and corporate governance requirements, trying to understand whether this document represented a genuine legal instrument or simply a preliminary draft that had never been properly executed or filed with the appropriate authorities. The complexity of the legal language and the potential consequences of acting on this information convinced me that I needed professional legal advice before taking any steps that might affect my relationship with my family or my former company. Finding an attorney who could provide guidance without creating conflicts of interest proved challenging in a small town where most lawyers had existing relationships with local businesses and families, but I eventually contacted Sarah Chen, a former law school classmate who had moved to Cedar Falls to start her own practice specializing in small business law and family legal disputes. Sarah's analysis of the trust document was thorough and sobering, confirming that it appeared to be a legally valid instrument that had been properly filed with the state and that designated me as the holder of 51% ownership in Morgan Construction Supply, with the remaining 49% held in a separate trust for Ryan's eventual benefit. According to Sarah's interpretation of the document, my father had apparently established this arrangement as a way to ensure that the business would be controlled by the family member who demonstrated the greatest competence and commitment to its success, while also providing financial security for Ryan even if he chose to pursue other career opportunities. The most shocking revelation was that this ownership transfer had occurred without my knowledge or consent, suggesting that my father had been planning for years to eventually inform me of my legal status as the company's majority owner but had delayed this conversation for reasons that I could only speculate about given his subsequent stroke and the family crisis that had followed. Sarah explained that my ownership status gave me significant legal rights that my family had apparently ignored when they forced me out of the company, including the right to participate in major business decisions, access to financial records, and protection against removal from management positions without proper legal procedures and documentation. The question now was whether I wanted to use this information to reclaim my position at Morgan Construction Supply through legal action, or whether I preferred to continue building my independent consulting business while keeping this knowledge as insurance against any future attempts by my family to interfere with my career or financial security. For the first time since being betrayed by the people I had trusted most in the world, I felt like I had some control over my own destiny rather than being a victim of other people's decisions about my value and future prospects. The choice I made would determine not just my own future, but the fate of the family business that had shaped my entire adult life and the relationships that had defined my identity for more than 3 decades. The morning I decided to exercise my legal rights as majority shareholder felt like standing at the edge of a cliff, knowing that once I jumped, there would be no graceful way back to solid ground. My hands trembled as I reviewed the corporate documents one final time, the weight of Dad's legacy pressing down on my shoulders like a physical burden I could no longer ignore. The interim CEO I'd contacted, Margaret Chin, sat across from me in the sterile conference room, her sharp eyes scanning through the financial reports with the kind of professional detachment that both comforted and terrified me. "The situation is worse than I initially thought," Margaret said, her voice carrying the authority of someone who had salvaged dozens of failing companies throughout her distinguished career. "Your brother has been making decisions that suggest either complete incompetence or deliberate sabotage, and frankly, I'm not sure which scenario would be more damaging to your father's company." She slid a thick folder across the mahogany table, the same table where Dad had once hosted board meetings filled with optimism and strategic planning sessions that lasted well into the evening hours. I opened the folder with the kind of dread usually reserved for medical test results, and what I found inside made my stomach lurch with a mixture of anger and devastating disappointment. Ryan had hired 6 new executives in the past 4 months, each commanding salaries that exceeded what most of our long-term employees made in 2 years combined. He'd approved marketing campaigns that were not only ineffective but seemed designed to alienate our core customer base, the very people who had supported Dad's vision for over 2 decades. "The hemorrhaging needs to stop immediately," Margaret continued, her tone becoming more urgent as she pointed to specific line items that painted a picture of financial recklessness. "We're looking at potential bankruptcy within 18 months if these spending patterns continue, and that's assuming no major economic downturns or unexpected expenses that could accelerate the timeline even further." The weight of her words settled over me like a heavy blanket, and I realized that my hesitation to act decisively wasn't just about preserving family relationships anymore. It was about potentially watching everything Dad had built crumble into dust while I stood by paralyzed by indecision. I thought about the employees who had worked alongside Dad for years, the ones who remembered when the company was just a small operation run out of a converted garage, and how their livelihoods now hung in the balance because of choices I was either brave enough or cowardly enough to make. "What do you recommend as our first step?" I asked, surprised by how steady my voice sounded despite the internal chaos that was threatening to overwhelm my ability to think clearly about the enormously complex situation unfolding before me. Margaret leaned back in her chair, studying me with the kind of analytical gaze that suggested she was evaluating not just my business acumen but my fundamental character and determination to see difficult decisions through to their conclusion. "We need to immediately revoke Ryan's access to company funds and decision-making authority, then conduct a comprehensive review of every contract and commitment he's made since taking control of operations." The next few hours passed in a blur of legal documents, phone calls to attorneys, and the kind of administrative maneuvering that felt simultaneously empowering and deeply unsettling, as if I was dismantling the very foundation of family trust that had once seemed unshakable. When Ryan finally stormed into the office, his face flushed with the kind of rage that comes from being publicly embarrassed in front of colleagues and subordinates, I was ready for the confrontation even though my heart was pounding with anticipation of the emotional warfare about to unfold. "What the hell do you think you're doing?" he shouted, his voice echoing through the reception area where several employees pretended not to notice the family drama that was now playing out in full view of everyone who had once respected our father's professional demeanor. I stood up slowly, drawing on reserves of strength I hadn't known existed until this moment when everything Dad had worked for was hanging in the balance between reasonable business decisions and family loyalty. "I'm saving the company that Dad spent his entire adult life building, the same company you've been systematically destroying through incompetence and reckless spending that would make him ashamed if he were here to witness it." Ryan's face contorted with a mixture of disbelief and fury that suggested he genuinely couldn't comprehend how his younger sister had managed to outmaneuver him in the corporate chess game he'd assumed he was destined to win. "You betrayed the family," he snarled, pointing an accusatory finger at me as if I were the one who had violated some sacred trust rather than simply exercising legal rights that Dad had specifically granted me. "I'm protecting the family legacy," I replied, fighting to keep my voice level despite the emotional storm raging inside me as I watched my brother transform into someone I barely recognized. "The same legacy you've been squandering while convincing yourself that throwing money at problems and hiring expensive consultants constitutes effective leadership in a business environment that demands careful planning and strategic thinking." Our mother appeared in the doorway at that moment, her expression carrying the kind of disappointed judgment that had always been her most effective weapon in family disputes, and I realized that the battle lines were being drawn exactly as I had feared they would be. "Elise, how could you do this to your own brother?" she asked, her voice trembling with what appeared to be genuine emotional pain but might have been calculated manipulation designed to make me doubt my own judgment. "I tried to work with him," I said, turning to face her while keeping Ryan in my peripheral vision because his agitation suggested he might do something impulsive and potentially destructive. I offered suggestions, I pointed out problems, I begged him to consider the long-term consequences of his decisions, but he dismissed everything I said as if my business education and understanding of Dad's vision were completely worthless. Margaret cleared her throat diplomatically, reminding everyone present that this family drama was unfolding in a professional setting where employees and potential clients might witness the kind of dysfunction that could permanently damage the company's reputation in the business community. Perhaps we should continue this conversation in a more private setting, she suggested, her tone carrying the authority of someone who had navigated countless similar situations throughout her consulting career. But Ryan wasn't interested in diplomatic solutions or private conversations that might allow him to save face while acknowledging the reality of his failures as a business leader. "This is my company," he shouted, his voice cracking with the kind of desperation that comes from watching carefully constructed delusions collapse under the weight of objective reality. "Dad always intended for me to run it, and you know it." The conversation that followed was perhaps the most painful 30 minutes of my entire life, as I watched my brother oscillate between rage, denial, and something approaching pleading as the full scope of his mismanagement became impossible for him to ignore or rationalize away. Margaret presented the financial analysis with the kind of clinical precision that made every poor decision seem even more damaging, every wasted dollar feel like a betrayal of the employees who had trusted our family to preserve their jobs and the company culture Dad had worked so hard to establish. "The 6 executives you hired in the past 4 months will need to be terminated immediately," Margaret explained, her voice remaining professionally neutral despite the obvious discomfort of delivering such devastating news to someone who clearly hadn't anticipated the consequences of his actions. "Their combined salaries represent nearly 40% of our current operational budget, and none of them have produced measurable results that justify their continued employment." Ryan's face went pale as the implications of her words sank in, and I could see him beginning to understand that his vision of effortless leadership and automatic respect was crumbling around him like a house built on shifting sand. "You can't do this," he whispered, but there was no conviction in his voice, only the hollow sound of someone who was finally confronting the gap between his self-perception and his actual capabilities. "I can, and I will," I replied, feeling a strange mixture of sadness and relief as I finally embraced the responsibility that Dad had entrusted to me through his carefully crafted will and corporate structure. "Because if I don't act now, there won't be a company left to save, and everyone who depends on us for their livelihood will suffer because we were too concerned about family feelings to make the hard decisions that effective leadership sometimes requires." The weeks that followed were a master class in corporate damage control and family relationship management, as I worked with Margaret to stabilize the company's finances while navigating the emotional minefield that our family dinners had become. Ryan initially threatened to sue, claiming that I had somehow manipulated Dad's will or coerced him into granting me majority control. But his attorney quickly explained that the legal documentation was ironclad and any challenge would likely result in further embarrassment and significant legal fees he couldn't afford. The layoffs were brutal but necessary, and I found myself having conversations with people who had families and mortgages and dreams that were now being disrupted because of decisions my brother had made without considering their human cost. Some of them were angry, directing their frustration at me as the visible face of the cuts, while others seemed to understand that I was trying to save what could be saved rather than letting everything collapse under the weight of unsustainable spending. Ryan's spiral was painful to watch, even through my anger and disappointment at his betrayal of Dad's trust and the company's mission. He would show up at the office at random times, demanding to speak with employees who no longer reported to him, or trying to access computer systems that Margaret had wisely secured to prevent any further damage to our operations or client relationships. During one particularly difficult encounter, I found him sitting in Dad's office, staring at the family photos that still decorated the desk where so many important decisions had been made over the years. "I don't understand how it came to this," he said, his voice carrying a vulnerability I hadn't heard since we were children dealing with scraped knees and playground disappointments. "It came to this because you stopped listening," I replied, sitting down across from him in the chair where I had once received homework help and career advice from the man whose legacy we were both struggling to honor in our own flawed ways. "Dad tried to teach you about responsibility and careful planning and treating employees with respect, but you were so focused on the authority and prestige that you forgot about the actual work of leadership." The conversation that followed was perhaps the most honest discussion we'd had since Dad's funeral, as Ryan finally began to acknowledge the reality of his failures while I struggled to balance my anger with the love I still felt for my brother despite everything that had happened. He admitted that he had felt overwhelmed by the complexity of running the company, that he had hired expensive consultants because he didn't trust his own judgment, and that he had made increasingly desperate decisions as the problems mounted beyond his ability to understand or solve them effectively. "I want to make this right," he said eventually, his voice barely above a whisper as he struggled with the humiliation of admitting his mistakes to his younger sister. "But I don't know how, and I'm not sure you'll ever trust me enough to give me another chance to prove that I can learn from this experience." The offer I made him surprised even me, emerging from some combination of pragmatic business thinking and stubborn family loyalty that refused to completely write off someone who had once been my closest childhood companion and partner in countless adventures around Dad's workplace. "There's an entry-level position open in our sales department," I said, watching his face carefully as he processed the implications of what I was suggesting. "If you want to be part of this company's future, you'll need to earn your way up from the bottom, learning every aspect of the business the way Dad always said he wished he had made you do before giving you so much responsibility." The silence that followed was heavy with years of sibling rivalry, parental expectations, and the weight of a family business that had become both a blessing and a burden for everyone involved in its operation. Ryan's pride was clearly warring with his desperate need to remain connected to the company that represented his primary source of identity and self-worth, and I could see him struggling with the humiliation of accepting a position that would put him on equal footing with recent college graduates and career changers. "Entry level," he repeated, the words seeming to stick in his throat as he contemplated the dramatic reversal of fortune that had transformed him from company president to potential junior employee in the span of a few devastating weeks. "Entry level," I confirmed, maintaining eye contact despite the emotional difficulty of watching my older brother confront the consequences of his choices in such a visceral and immediate way. "With the possibility of advancement based on performance, attitude, and your ability to work collaboratively with colleagues who will initially know more about day-to-day operations than you do." Ryan left the office that day without giving me an answer, and for several weeks I wondered if his pride would prevent him from accepting what was essentially a lifeline disguised as a demotion, an opportunity to rebuild his relationship with the company and the family business that had defined so much of our shared history. Margaret warned me that bringing him back in any capacity might create ongoing drama and workplace tension, but something in my heart insisted that completely severing ties with my brother would represent a failure of the compassion and loyalty that Dad had always tried to instill in both of us. When Ryan finally returned to accept the position, he looked like a man who had aged several years in the span of a few months, his usual confidence replaced by a quiet humility that was both encouraging and deeply sad to witness. "I'll take the job," he said simply, without the explanations or justifications I had expected, and I realized that sometimes the most profound changes happen when people finally stop talking and start accepting the reality of their circumstances. The early days of Ryan's return were awkward for everyone involved, as longtime employees struggled to adjust to seeing the former president answering phones and learning basic sales procedures from people who had once deferred to his authority without question. But gradually, something remarkable began to happen as my brother discovered aspects of the business he had never bothered to understand during his brief tenure as the person supposedly in charge of everything. He learned about the individual customers who had supported the company through economic downturns and competitive challenges, developing relationships with people whose names he had never known despite their years of loyalty to Dad's vision and business philosophy. He began to understand the intricate logistics of inventory management and quality control, the behind-the-scenes work that made the company's reputation possible but had never been visible from his previous executive perspective. Most importantly, he started to appreciate the dedication and expertise of employees he had previously dismissed as replaceable resources rather than recognizing them as the skilled professionals whose knowledge and commitment formed the actual foundation of everything Dad had built over decades of careful attention to detail and relationship building. The transformation wasn't immediate or complete, and there were still moments when Ryan's old arrogance would surface, causing tension with coworkers who remembered his previous dismissive attitude toward their contributions and suggestions. But Margaret and I both noticed gradual improvements in his work ethic and interpersonal skills, signs that he was finally beginning to internalize the lessons about leadership and responsibility that Dad had tried to teach him before it was too late. Our family dinners remained strained, with Mom continuing to express disapproval of my decisions and Ryan's obvious discomfort with his changed circumstances creating an undercurrent of tension that made even casual conversation feel loaded with unspoken resentments and disappointments. But there were also moments of unexpected connection, brief glimpses of the siblings we had once been before corporate politics and inheritance disputes had complicated our relationship beyond easy recognition or repair. As I watched Ryan slowly rebuild his understanding of the company and his place within it, I found myself hoping that this painful chapter in our family story might eventually lead to something stronger and more authentic than the superficial harmony we had maintained before Dad's death forced us all to confront uncomfortable truths about our assumptions and expectations. The business was stabilizing under Margaret's guidance and my gradually increasing confidence in making difficult decisions, but the real measure of success would be whether we could preserve the values and relationships that had made Dad's work meaningful in the first place. The inheritance he had left me wasn't just financial assets and legal control. it was the responsibility to honor his memory by building something worthy of the sacrifice and dedication he had invested in creating opportunities for his family and employees alike. And as I sat in his office late one evening, reviewing reports that showed gradual improvement in our financial position and employee morale, I realized that the hardest part of leadership wasn't making tough decisions about budgets and personnel, but finding ways to hold on to hope and compassion even when circumstances seemed designed to encourage cynicism and emotional detachment from the human cost of necessary changes. The hollow feeling that settled in my chest after the initial crisis passed was something I hadn't anticipated, a strange emptiness that accompanied what should have been satisfaction at successfully steering the company away from the brink of financial disaster. Victory, I discovered, tasted remarkably like ash when it came at the cost of family relationships and required making decisions that hurt people I cared about, even when those decisions were undeniably necessary for the survival of everything my father had worked to build. The office atmosphere had become a careful dance of professional courtesy layered over personal tensions that everyone could feel but no one dared address directly, creating the kind of workplace environment where genuine collaboration felt almost impossible despite our shared commitment to the company's mission. Employees who had once greeted me warmly now offered polite nods and cautious smiles, clearly uncertain about how to navigate the complex dynamics of working alongside both the new owner and the demoted former president who still carried the family name and all the complicated history that came with it. Margaret Chen had warned me that the adjustment period would be difficult, but she couldn't have prepared me for the daily weight of making moral calculations about every interaction with Ryan, every decision about his performance, every moment when I had to choose between protecting the company culture and offering my brother the patience and guidance he clearly needed to become a functioning member of the team. Should I intervene when I saw him struggling with basic sales procedures, risking the appearance of favoritism that could undermine my credibility with other employees? Or should I let him fail and learn from his mistakes, even if that failure might reflect poorly on the family name and company reputation? My mother's response to the changes had been perhaps the most painful aspect of the entire situation, as she channeled her disappointment and sense of betrayal into a campaign of subtle undermining that made every family gathering feel like navigating a diplomatic minefield filled with carefully placed emotional explosives. She would make comments to extended family members about how I had destroyed the family unity for the sake of money and power, conveniently overlooking the financial reality that Ryan's mismanagement had created and the genuine risk that inaction would have meant losing everything Dad had spent his lifetime creating. The rumors she spread through her social circles painted me as a calculating opportunist who had manipulated Dad's final wishes to steal control from my more deserving brother, a narrative that ignored both the legal documentation that clearly outlined Dad's intentions and the objective evidence of Ryan's failures as a business leader. Part of me wanted to confront her directly, to demand that she choose between supporting the family business or continuing her destructive campaign of gossip and resentment. But another part of me recognized that firing my own mother would create exactly the kind of family scandal that could permanently damage our reputation in the close-knit business community where personal relationships often determine professional opportunities. Late at night, when the office was empty and I could finally drop the mask of confident leadership that had become my daily armor, I found myself remembering the rare moments when Dad had offered genuine praise for my academic achievements or business insights, brief glimpses of approval that had felt like sunlight breaking through storm clouds. But those memories were complicated by the recognition that his praise had always been conditional, tied to performance and achievement rather than the unconditional love that every child craves from their parents, and I began to understand how his legacy of emotional distance had shaped both Ryan's desperate need for validation and my own tendency to equate personal worth with professional success. The conversation with my younger sister Sarah came at a moment when I was feeling particularly isolated by the weight of leadership and the growing distance between myself and almost everyone in my family, including people I had once counted among my closest confidants and sources of emotional support. She had always been the quiet one, the peacemaker who tried to smooth over family conflicts by making herself smaller and less noticeable, but when she finally found the courage to share her perspective on our family dynamics, her words carried the impact of long-suppressed truth finally being allowed into the light. "I've felt invisible my entire life," she said during what was supposed to be a casual coffee meeting, her voice trembling with years of accumulated hurt that I had been too focused on my own struggles to notice or address appropriately. "Dad was so busy grooming Ryan to take over the business and challenging you to prove yourself worthy of respect that he never seemed to have any energy left for figuring out what I might need or want from our relationship." The realization that my sister had been suffering in silence while I was fighting my own battles for recognition and respect hit me like a physical blow, forcing me to confront the possibility that my focus on claiming my rightful place in the family business had blinded me to other people's pain and unmet needs. Sarah went on to describe years of feeling like a supporting character in her own family story, watching from the sidelines as Ryan and I competed for Dad's attention and approval while she struggled with anxiety and depression that no one seemed to notice or take seriously enough to address with professional help. "I want to help you find work that makes you feel valued and fulfilled," I told her, reaching across the small cafe table to take her hand while fighting back tears that had been building from months of emotional stress and isolation. "And I think we should also explore therapy options that might help you process some of the family dynamics that have been affecting your sense of self-worth and your ability to pursue your own goals and dreams." Sarah's gratitude was overwhelming and heartbreaking, a reminder that sometimes the most important leadership decisions happen not in boardrooms or strategic planning sessions but in quiet conversations where we choose to prioritize human connection over professional obligations and personal ambitions. I realized that my success as a business owner would ultimately be meaningless if I couldn't also succeed as a sister, daughter, and member of a family that needed healing more than it needed corporate profits or public recognition for our professional achievements. Meanwhile, Ryan's gradual transformation continued to unfold in small, almost imperceptible changes that might have been easy to dismiss if I hadn't been watching so carefully for signs of genuine growth rather than superficial compliance with the new workplace dynamics. Instead of demanding answers from colleagues who knew more about specific procedures than he did, he began asking questions with a humility that seemed foreign to his previous personality but suggested that he was finally beginning to understand the difference between authority and expertise. The breakthrough moment came during a late evening when we found ourselves alone in the warehouse, both of us staying past normal business hours to handle an inventory crisis that required immediate attention and couldn't wait for the next business day to be addressed properly. The physical work of moving boxes and checking shipment records created a different kind of interaction than our usual office encounters, stripping away some of the formal professional barriers that had made genuine communication almost impossible since his return to the company. "I need to tell you something," Ryan said suddenly, setting down the clipboard he had been using to track inventory numbers and turning to face me with an expression that combined exhaustion, vulnerability, and something that might have been relief at finally having an opportunity for honest conversation. "I've resented being the golden child almost as much as you resented not being recognized for your achievements, and I think that resentment has been poisoning both of us for years." The words hung in the air between us like a bridge that neither of us had expected to find in the middle of what had seemed like an unbridgeable chasm of hurt feelings and mutual disappointment, and I found myself setting aside my own defensive reactions to really listen to what my brother was trying to communicate about his experience of our family dynamics. He went on to explain that Dad's expectations had felt like a crushing weight rather than an honor, that he had always known he wasn't naturally suited for business leadership but had been afraid to disappoint everyone by admitting his limitations and pursuing a different path that might have been more aligned with his actual interests and abilities. "I never felt competent," he continued, his voice breaking slightly as years of hidden insecurity finally found expression in this unlikely setting surrounded by boxes and shipping equipment. "Every decision felt like I was pretending to be someone I wasn't, and I hated you for being so naturally good at everything that came easily to you but felt impossible for me to master no matter how hard I tried." The tears that followed were probably inevitable, a release of emotional pressure that had been building since childhood as we competed for parental approval and struggled to define ourselves within family roles that had never quite fit our actual personalities or natural inclinations. I found myself confessing that I had always wanted his approval almost as much as Dad's, that his dismissal of my ideas and contributions had hurt more than any professional setback because it represented rejection from someone whose opinion mattered deeply to me despite our complicated relationship. "I always thought you saw me as competition," I admitted, surprised by how difficult it was to speak honestly about feelings I had kept hidden for so long behind layers of professional competence and family loyalty. "But I never wanted to compete with you. I wanted to work alongside you and build something together that would honor Dad's memory while also reflecting both of our strengths and perspectives." The conversation that followed was perhaps the most honest exchange we had shared since childhood, as we both acknowledged the ways that Dad's parenting style had pitted us against each other rather than teaching us to support and complement each other's different abilities and approaches to problem solving. Ryan admitted that his recent behavior had been driven partly by shame at his failures and partly by a desperate attempt to prove that he deserved the confidence Dad had placed in him, even when that confidence had felt more like a burden than a gift. We weren't suddenly best friends or perfect business partners, but something fundamental shifted in our relationship that night as we finished the inventory work and locked up the warehouse together, walking to our cars under the parking lot lights like colleagues who had finally found a way to respect each other's different strengths and acknowledge each other's legitimate struggles with the complex legacy our father had left for both of us to navigate. The decision to promote Linda Martinez to partner came after months of observing how she had quietly held the company together during Ryan's chaotic leadership and my own learning curve as the new owner, demonstrating exactly the kind of steady competence and institutional knowledge that successful businesses require to weather periods of transition and uncertainty. She had been with the company for 15 years, starting as an administrative assistant and gradually taking on more responsibility as she proved herself capable of handling increasingly complex challenges with grace and strategic thinking that impressed both clients and colleagues. "I want to offer you a partnership position," I told her during what she probably assumed would be a routine performance review, watching as surprise and carefully controlled excitement played across her face while she processed the implications of what I was suggesting. "The company needs leadership that understands both our operational realities and our cultural values, and you've demonstrated both qualities consistently throughout your tenure here." Linda's acceptance of the partnership offer marked the beginning of a new phase in the company's evolution, as we worked together to implement changes that would create a more collaborative and inclusive workplace culture while maintaining the high standards of customer service and professional excellence that had always distinguished our organization from competitors. She brought perspectives and insights that had been missing from previous leadership discussions, particularly regarding employee development and retention strategies that could help us build a more stable and satisfied workforce. The cultural changes weren't immediate or dramatic, but they were noticeable to anyone who had been paying attention to the subtle dynamics that shape workplace relationships and determine whether employees feel valued and heard or simply tolerated as necessary resources for achieving business objectives. We instituted regular feedback sessions where team members could share concerns and suggestions without fear of retaliation, created professional development opportunities that had previously been available only to family members or senior executives, and established clear performance criteria that rewarded merit and initiative rather than just longevity or personal connections. Ryan's response to these changes was another test of his genuine commitment to growth and adaptation, and I was cautiously encouraged by his willingness to participate in the new feedback processes and accept constructive criticism from colleagues who had previously been reluctant to challenge his decisions or suggest improvements to his work methods. He seemed to understand that the company's success required everyone to be accountable for their contributions and open to continuous learning, regardless of their family connections or previous positions of authority. As I reflected on the journey from Dad's funeral to this new equilibrium of shared leadership and family healing, I realized that inheriting the business had taught me lessons about power and responsibility that no business school curriculum could have provided, forcing me to confront the complex intersection of personal relationships and professional obligations in ways that had fundamentally changed my understanding of what effective leadership actually requires. The price of control had been higher than I had anticipated, measured not just in financial stress and family conflict but in the personal growth that comes from learning to balance competing demands and navigate situations where there are no perfect solutions, only choices that reflect our deepest values and commitments. The company that emerged from this period of crisis and transformation wasn't exactly what Dad had envisioned, but it carried forward the essential elements of his legacy while adapting to realities he couldn't have anticipated, creating space for different leadership styles and family dynamics that honored both tradition and the need for evolution in changing business environments. And perhaps most importantly, it had become a place where Sarah could eventually find meaningful work, where Ryan could rebuild his sense of competence and purpose, and where I could exercise the kind of leadership that combined professional excellence with genuine care for the people whose lives were affected by the decisions made in boardrooms and executive offices. 2 years had passed since that devastating night in the warehouse when Ryan and I finally broke through decades of resentment and misunderstanding, and the company that now bore my leadership felt like an entirely different organism from the struggling, dysfunctional business I had inherited during those dark months following Dad's funeral. The financial reports that crossed my desk each month told a story of steady growth and increasing stability, but more importantly, they reflected the kind of workplace culture that attracted talented people who wanted to build careers rather than simply collect paychecks while waiting for better opportunities elsewhere. The morning routine that had once felt like preparing for battle now carried the comfortable rhythm of purposeful work, as I walked through the office greeting employees who seemed genuinely happy to be there and engaged with projects that challenged their abilities while contributing to something larger than their individual ambitions. Linda Martinez had proven herself to be exactly the kind of partner I had hoped for, bringing a collaborative leadership style that complemented my more analytical approach while ensuring that every voice in our organization felt heard and valued regardless of hierarchy or length of service. Ryan's transformation into a competent procurement manager had been perhaps the most surprising development of the past 2 years, as he discovered that his natural attention to detail and relationship-building abilities were perfectly suited for negotiating with suppliers and managing the complex logistics of inventory management that kept our operations running smoothly. He had finally found his place within the company structure, not as the commanding leader he had once aspired to become, but as a valued team member whose contributions were recognized and appreciated by colleagues who had learned to respect his growing expertise in his chosen specialization. The conversation we had shared the previous week about his role in the company's future had revealed just how much both of us had changed since those early days of crisis and conflict, as he spoke with genuine satisfaction about his work and acknowledged that his current position felt more authentic and fulfilling than his brief, disastrous tenure as president had ever been. I used to think success meant being in charge of everything, he had told me while reviewing quarterly procurement reports that demonstrated his increasing competence and value to the organization. Now I understand that success means finding where you can contribute most effectively and taking pride in doing that work better than anyone else could. Sarah's integration into the company as our communications coordinator had brought a different kind of energy to our workplace, as her natural empathy and creative problem-solving abilities helped us develop more effective ways of connecting with both employees and clients who were looking for business partners that understood the human side of professional relationships. The therapy sessions I had encouraged her to pursue had helped her develop confidence in her own abilities and perspectives, transforming her from the invisible family member she had always felt herself to be into someone whose insights and contributions were actively sought by colleagues who valued her unique approach to workplace challenges. Our family dinners had evolved from minefields of unspoken resentment into something approaching normal family gatherings, though Mom's emotional distance remained a constant reminder that some wounds heal more slowly than others and that forgiveness is sometimes a process rather than a single decision. She had stopped actively undermining my leadership through gossip and criticism, but her polite formality made it clear that she still struggled to accept the reality that her youngest daughter had become the head of the family business and the primary decision-maker for matters that affected everyone's financial security and professional future. "She'll come around eventually," Sarah had suggested during one of our weekly coffee meetings, though I suspected that my sister's natural optimism was coloring her assessment of Mom's capacity for genuine reconciliation rather than mere tactical acceptance of circumstances she couldn't change. "She's proud of what you've accomplished, even if she can't bring herself to say it directly, and I think she's beginning to understand that Dad made the right choice in trusting you with the company's future." The employee feedback sessions that had become a regular part of our company culture consistently revealed satisfaction levels that exceeded industry averages, with particular praise for the mentorship programs and professional development opportunities that we had implemented to ensure that talented people could build long-term careers without having to seek advancement opportunities elsewhere. The diversity initiatives that Linda and I had championed had not only created a more inclusive workplace but had also brought fresh perspectives and innovative approaches that had improved our problem-solving capabilities and client satisfaction ratings across all sectors of our business operations. The moment that crystallized my understanding of how fundamentally the company culture had changed came during a conversation with Marcus Thompson, a recent hire who had joined our sales team after completing his MBA at a prestigious business school where he could have pursued opportunities with much larger corporations offering higher starting salaries and more traditional career advancement paths. "You're the reason I applied here," he told me during what was supposed to be a routine check-in about his integration into our team and his satisfaction with his role and responsibilities. His explanation of that statement revealed something about the company's reputation that I hadn't fully understood until that moment, as he described how our commitment to employee development and ethical business practices had become known throughout the regional business community as an example of how family-owned companies could modernize and grow while maintaining the personal touch and values-driven approach that often gets lost in larger corporate environments. "I heard about what you did," he continued, his voice carrying the kind of respect that can't be manufactured or demanded but must be earned through consistent actions that demonstrate genuine integrity and leadership capability. The story he had heard through professional networks and business school case studies was apparently a somewhat simplified version of our family's journey through crisis and transformation, but it had captured the essential elements of choosing principle over convenience, long-term sustainability over short-term profit, and collaborative leadership over authoritarian control that had guided my approach to rebuilding both the company and the family relationships that had been damaged by years of unaddressed dysfunction and misplaced priorities. "People want to work for leaders who make hard decisions for the right reasons," Marcus explained, unconsciously echoing advice that Dad had given me years earlier but that I had been too young and inexperienced to fully appreciate at the time. "They want to be part of organizations that treat employees as whole human beings with lives and dreams and challenges outside of work, not just as resources to be optimized for maximum efficiency and minimum cost." The recognition that my leadership style had become something other people actively sought out rather than simply tolerated was both gratifying and humbling, forcing me to confront the reality that the choices I had made during our darkest period had created ripple effects that extended far beyond the immediate crisis and had established a foundation for the kind of sustainable success that benefits everyone involved rather than just enriching a few people at the top of the organizational hierarchy. The quarterly business review meeting that had taken place the previous month had provided concrete evidence of how our employee-focused approach was translating into measurable business results, with productivity metrics, client retention rates, and profitability margins, all showing consistent improvement over the past 18 months as our workplace culture had stabilized and our reputation for ethical business practices had attracted both talented employees and quality clients who valued long-term partnerships over transactional relationships. Linda's presentation of our employee satisfaction survey results had been particularly encouraging, revealing that nearly 90% of our team members felt valued and respected in their roles, believed that their contributions were recognized and fairly compensated, and would recommend our company to friends and family members who were seeking employment opportunities in our industry. These numbers represent more than just job satisfaction, she had explained to the assembled team leaders and department heads who had worked so hard to create the kind of workplace environment that attracted and retained top talent. They represent the foundation of sustainable growth that comes from having employees who are emotionally invested in the company's success because they understand that their individual achievements and professional development are genuinely supported and celebrated rather than simply exploited for corporate benefit. The financial stability that we had achieved over the past 2 years had created opportunities for expansion and innovation that would have been impossible during the chaotic period when Ryan's mismanagement had threatened the company's very survival. But more importantly, it had provided the breathing room necessary for thoughtful strategic planning and careful consideration of how growth should be managed to preserve the values and culture that had become our competitive advantage in an increasingly impersonal business environment. The conversation I had shared with Dad's longtime business mentor, Robert Chin, during a chance encounter at a professional conference had provided perspective on how unusual our family's journey had been and how rare it was for family businesses to successfully navigate the kind of fundamental transformation we had undergone without losing either their financial viability or their core identity. Most family companies either stagnate under the weight of tradition and personal politics, or they lose their soul in the pursuit of growth and efficiency, he had observed, his weathered face reflecting decades of experience helping business owners navigate the complex intersection of family relationships and professional responsibilities. What you've accomplished is remarkable not just because you saved the company from bankruptcy, but because you managed to evolve the culture and leadership structure while preserving the values and personal connections that made the business worth saving in the first place. The evening ritual of walking through the empty office after most employees had gone home had become one of my favorite parts of each day, providing quiet time to reflect on the progress we had made and the challenges that still lay ahead as we continue to grow and adapt to changing market conditions and evolving client expectations. The framed photos that now decorated the walls told the story of our transformation, showing company picnics and award ceremonies and team-building events that celebrated both professional achievements and personal milestones that mattered to the people who had chosen to invest their careers in our shared vision of what a family business could become. Ryan's desk in the procurement department, organized with the kind of methodical precision that had always been part of his personality but had been overshadowed by his desperate attempts to appear decisive and commanding during his brief period as company president, now reflected someone who had found peace with his actual abilities and genuine satisfaction in work that matched his natural inclinations rather than forcing him to pretend to be someone he wasn't suited to become. The relationship between us had evolved into something that resembled friendship more than the competitive sibling rivalry that had defined our interactions for most of our lives, built on mutual respect for each other's different strengths and acknowledgement of the ways that our family's dysfunction had damaged both of us in different but equally significant ways. We would never be best friends or confidants, but we had learned to work together effectively and support each other's professional growth while maintaining appropriate boundaries that protected both our working relationship and our slowly healing family connections. The phone call from Mom that had come the previous evening had surprised me with its tone of cautious pride rather than the defensive formality that had characterized most of our interactions since I had taken control of the company and made the difficult decisions that had been necessary to ensure its survival and eventual prosperity. "I saw the article about the company in the Business Journal," she had said, her voice carrying undertones of emotion that she still struggled to express directly but that suggested her understanding of my accomplishments was evolving even if her ability to communicate that understanding remained limited by years of accumulated disappointment and hurt feelings. "Your father would be proud of what you've built," she had added after a long pause, and although the words felt like too little too late, they also represented a form of acknowledgement that I had been waiting for without even realizing how much I needed to hear her recognize that my leadership had been successful in ways that went beyond mere financial metrics or professional accolades. The legacy I was building felt fundamentally different from the one Dad had envisioned when he first started the company decades earlier, shaped not just by changing business practices and evolving workplace expectations but by my own understanding of what leadership meant and what kinds of relationships and values were worth preserving and promoting in an increasingly complex and competitive business environment. The most lasting legacy, I had come to understand, wasn't the family business itself but the kind of leader I had chosen to become through the crucible of crisis and transformation that had tested every assumption I had held about success, family loyalty, and the intersection of personal integrity with professional responsibility. The young woman who had once felt dismissed and undervalued by family members who couldn't see past their own expectations and limitations had grown into someone who could make difficult decisions with confidence while maintaining compassion for people whose needs and perspectives differed from her own. Someone who understood that true leadership meant creating opportunities for others to succeed rather than simply accumulating power and authority for its own sake. As I turned off the office lights and locked the door behind me, I found myself thinking about Dad's old accusation that I didn't belong in this family. Words that had once cut deeply but now seemed almost laughably irrelevant to the reality of what I had accomplished and who I had become through the process of proving him wrong in ways he could never have anticipated. He once told me I didn't belong in this family. Turns out, I outgrew it, and now he works for me.